The hands that caught the picture this. A small room, somewhere in the deep folds of time. The walls are rough stone or packed earth, cool to the touch. A single flame trembles on a clay lamp, casting shadows that dance like spirits across the ceiling. The air is thick with breath and effort, with the primal rhythm of a body doing what bodies have done since the very beginning of human existence. There is pain here, yes, but also power. There is fear, but also trust. And in the center of it all, kneeling beside a laboring woman, are a pair of hands, not the hands of a king or a general, not the hands that signed treaties or painted masterpieces. These are working hands, calloused and strong, stained perhaps with herbs or earth, hands that have touched countless bodies in their most vulnerable moments. Hands that know, without textbooks or degrees, exactly what to do. They press gently on a swollen belly, feeling the position of the child within. They offer a cup of bitter tea brewed from roots gathered at dawn. They hold, they guide, they whisper words of encouragement that have been whispered in 1,000 languages across 10,000 years. These are the hands of a midwife, and they have been there in one form or another at nearly every human birth since our species learned to walk upright. Think about that for a moment. Every person you've ever known, every face in every photograph, every name in every history book, every conqueror and poet and prophet and peasant, all of them entered this world through a doorway of blood and water. And more often than not, there was a woman there who knew how to ease that passage. Not always a doctor, not always even someone whose name we know, but someone who held the knowledge, who carried the craft, who understood the sacred, ordinary miracle of birth. Yet, when we tell the story of medicine, when we recite the names of healers and innovators, these women are often nowhere to be found. They exist in the margins of history, in the footnotes, in the quiet spaces between the great events that historians deemed worthy of recording. They were too common, perhaps, too feminine, too associated with the body rather than the mind, with intuition rather than science, with women's work rather than men's achievement. But tonight, dear listener, we're going to change that. We're going to step back through the mists of history and meet these women. We're going to sit with them in candlelit rooms and sun-drenched courtyards, in peasant cottages and palace chambers, in times of reverence and times of terror. We're going to learn their names when we can and honor them when we cannot. We're going to trace the thread of their knowledge from the very dawn of civilization to the present moment, following it as it winds through ancient temples and medieval villages, through witch hunts and hospital wards, through suppression and survival and ultimate persistence. This is not a story of princes or battles. This is a story of women who caught babies and saved lives and passed down wisdom with such dedication that it survived everything. Survived empires rising and falling, survived plagues and wars, and the systematic attempt to erase their authority. This is a story that lives in our very bones, because every single one of us is here because of them. So make yourself comfortable now. Let your body settle into softness. Let your breath slow to the rhythm of waves on an ancient shore. Close your eyes if you haven't already, and let me take you on a journey. We're going to travel backward through time, past your grandmother's birth and her grandmother's birth, past gaslight and candlelight and firelight, past written history and into the realm of story and stone and buried bone. We're going to find the first hands that reached out to guide a newborn into the light. And then we're going to follow those hands forward again, through every century, every culture, every transformation and trial. And perhaps, as you drift toward sleep tonight, you'll feel a connection to something vast and ancient. Perhaps you'll sense the presence of all those women, countless as stars, who knew how to bring forth life. Perhaps you'll hear the echo of their voices, calm and sure in the darkness, saying the same things they've always said. You're doing well, breathe, I'm here. You're not alone. Almost there now, just a little more. The story of midwives is not a small story. It's not a side note or a curiosity. It's the story of how we survived as a species. It's the story of knowledge that predates writing, of skills learned through touch and observation rather than through books. It's the story of women's authority in an arena that belonged to them long before anyone thought to question it. It's the story of the body's wisdom and the hands that learned to work with it rather than against it. And it's a story that nearly got lost. There were centuries when being a midwife could get you burned as a witch. There were decades when the medical establishment dismissed everything midwives knew as superstition and ignorance. There were systems built specifically to push these women out, to replace them with men wielding forceps and authority, men who often knew less but claimed more. The story of midwifery is also a story of suppression, of knowledge stolen and credit denied, of expertise devalued simply because it was held by women. But here's the remarkable thing: it survived anyway. The knowledge survived, the practice survived, the calling survived. Because birth doesn't stop happening just because someone decides women shouldn't be the ones attending it. Because mothers kept seeking out the women who knew, who remembered, who carried the old ways in their capable hands. Because some kinds of wisdom run too deep to be fully erased. Tonight, as you listen to this story, you're part of that survival. You're bearing witness to these women, giving them space in your mind and heart, letting their legacy live in your consciousness, even if just for these quiet moments before sleep. And that matters. It matters that we remember them. It matters that we say their names when we can and honor their namelessness when we can't. It matters that we acknowledge what they gave us, what they preserved for us, what they suffered to keep alive. So let us begin at the very beginning, or as close to it as we can get. Let us go back to a time before cities or writing, before agriculture even, to the time when humans were still learning to be human. Let us imagine the first woman who stayed with another woman through the mystery and terror of birth. The first one who noticed that certain positions seemed to help. The first one who discovered that pressing here or supporting there or offering this herb or that encouragement could make the difference between life and death. We don't know her name. We'll never know her name. But she existed. She must have existed. And everything that came after, all the midwives, in all the centuries to come, they were her daughters, in spirit if not in blood. Are you still with me, dear dreamer? Can you feel yourself slipping backward through time, the modern world fading like morning mist? Good, stay with me. We have so far to go, and so many women to meet. We're going to walk through ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, through classical Greece and Rome, through the medieval world and the age of witch hunts, through the rise of modern medicine and the fight to reclaim what was almost lost, and through it all, we'll remember these were real women. They had names and faces, fears and dreams, children of their own, perhaps, or perhaps not. They felt the same exhaustion we feel, the same satisfaction in work well done. They worried about their patients and took pride in their skills. They passed their knowledge to the next generation with the same care that a master craftsperson teaches an apprentice. They were not saints or martyrs or symbols. They were humans doing necessary work with whatever tools and knowledge they possessed. Let your shoulders drop. Let the tension drain from your jaw and your hands. We're about to step into their world, and it requires a certain softness of spirit, a certain willingness to listen with more than just your ears. You'll need to listen with your imagination, with your empathy, with that part of you that knows, deep down, that you're connected to every human who came before you. If you've ever wondered about the women who held this ancient knowledge, leave a comment about what draws you to this story. What calls you to learn about midwives? Is it curiosity about history, connection to your own birth story, or the births you've witnessed? A sense that something valuable was almost lost? Whatever it is, it's valid. It's part of why this story needs to be told and retold, remembered and honored. Now let the lamp flame flicker one more time. Let the shadows settle. And let us go back to where it all began. Ancient beginnings. The first birth attendants. But where did this knowledge begin? How far back can we trace the hands that guided new life into the world? Let us slip further backward now. Past written history, past the first cities, into the realm where archaeology and anthropology must speak for us, because the written word did not yet exist. Imagine, if you will, a settlement perhaps 40,000 years ago. A small group of humans, perhaps 30 or 40 souls, living together in the shelter of a cave or a cluster of rough dwellings. They hunt and gather. They make tools from stone and bone. They paint images on rock walls. And yes, they give birth. Birth is not yet medicalized, not yet theorized or systematized. It simply is, as natural and necessary as eating or sleeping. But even then, even in those ancient times, someone noticed patterns. Someone observed that certain things helped and certain things didn't. Someone stayed with the laboring woman, offered water, pressed on her back when the pain grew fierce, helped her squat or lean or find whatever position brought relief. Someone caught the baby as it emerged, cleared its mouth and nose, tied off and cut the cord. Someone knew what to do when things went wrong, or at least knew how to try. This was the beginning, not formal or named, not yet a profession or a calling, but simply the accumulated wisdom of observation and experience. And crucially, this knowledge was passed from one woman to another. A daughter watching her mother attend a birth. A young woman learning from an elder. The knowledge flowing like water from one generation to the next, carried in memory and demonstration rather than in text. As humans developed agriculture and settled into the first true civilizations, as we built cities along the Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile, the Indus, this knowledge began to be formalized. We know this because these civilizations left records. Not many records about midwives specifically, because birth was considered women's business, but enough. Just enough to catch glimpses in ancient Mesopotamia, in the land between two rivers, where some of the world's first cities rose from the dust. There were women called subsutu, a word that translates roughly as she who grasps. Birth attendants. We know they existed because they appear in legal codes, in medical texts, in magical incantations meant to ease difficult labors. The Code of Hammurabi, that famous collection of laws carved in stone around 1750 BCE, mentions midwives in its provisions about payment and liability. If a midwife assisted successfully, she was to be paid. If a woman or child died in her care, she might face penalties, though notably less severe than those faced by male physicians who lost patients. The Mesopotamians believed that childbirth was overseen by protective goddesses. There was Nintur, the lady of birth, and Ninkursaya, the mother of all children. Midwives were seen as servants of these goddesses, carrying out divine work with human hands. When a woman went into labor, midwives might recite incantations invoking the goddesses' protection, asking them to loosen the womb and let the baby come forth easily. They used amulets and herbs, positioning and massage, prayer and practical knowledge, all woven together into a single practice. Let us drift now down the Nile to ancient Egypt, where the desert meets the river, and one of history's most magnificent civilizations flourished for 3,000 years. Egyptian women gave birth, attended by midwives called Kenner, and we know far more about their practices because the Egyptians, bless them, wrote everything down. They left us medical papyri, those precious scrolls of papyrus covered in hieratic script, detailing treatments and procedures. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, but likely copied from older sources, contains sections on obstetrics and gynecology. It describes how to determine if a woman is pregnant, how to predict the sex of the child, how to ease difficult labors. It mentions medications made from honey and herbs, fumigations to encourage the womb to expel the child, and practical advice about positioning. Egyptian women typically gave birth sitting or squatting on special birth bricks to mud bricks placed under the feet, with the midwife kneeling before her to catch the baby. The Egyptians had birth goddesses too. Toret, that wonderful hippopotamus deity, with her fierce, protective stance, watching over pregnant women and newborns. Base, the dwarf god, who warded off evil spirits during labor. And there were the 7 Hathors, divine midwives, who appeared at each birth to pronounce the child's fate. Egyptian art sometimes shows childbirth scenes, carved in relief or painted on tomb walls. We see women supported by midwives. We see the moment of birth. We see the baby being washed and the umbilical cord being cut. Egyptian midwives knew things that modern medicine would later forget and have to relearn. They understood that movement and upright positions helped labor progress. They knew that emotional support mattered as much as physical assistance. They recognized signs of complications and had strategies, not always successful, but born of careful observation, for addressing them. They knew which herbs could ease pain or strengthen contractions. They knew how to massage the belly and the back, how to apply warm compresses, how to speak calmly and confidently to a frightened mother, and they were respected. While Egyptian women had fewer legal rights than men, as was true nearly everywhere in the ancient world, midwives held an honored position. They were sought after, compensated for their services, sometimes even buried with dignity. We have found the tomb of a woman named Possession, who lived during the Old Kingdom, around 2400 BCE, and her title is often translated as Lady Overseer of the Lady Physicians, or possibly Overseer of Midwives. Whether she supervised female doctors or midwives, or both, her existence tells us that women's medical practice was established and organized, enough to require oversight. Now let us sail across the Mediterranean to ancient Greece, where philosophy was born, and theater flourished, and democracy began its long, imperfect journey. Greek women lived restricted lives, especially in Athens, where they were expected to remain in the women's quarters of the house, to speak little and be seen less. Yet, even here, in this world of male citizens debating in the agora, midwives had a place. They were called Maya, and the word itself is lovely, connected to the word for mother. The Greeks understood, at least in this one area, that women's expertise in women's matters made sense. Male physicians existed, yes, but they rarely attended births. Birth was women's business, and midwives were the experts. We know about Greek midwifery, partly through the writings of male physicians like Hippocrates and later the Hippocratic corpus, that collection of medical texts attributed to Hippocrates and his followers, contains treatises on gynecology and obstetrics. While these were written by men, they describe practices that were surely carried out primarily by midwives. The texts discuss how to position laboring women, how to recognize difficult labors, how to perform version, turning a baby in the womb to facilitate birth. Cyrannus of Ephesus, who lived in the 1st and 2nd century CE under Roman rule but was ethnically Greek, wrote the most comprehensive ancient text on gynecology and obstetrics. His treatise, Gynaeca, is remarkable. He describes in detail what makes a good midwife. She should be literate, he says, so she can read medical texts. She should have good memory and be hard-working. She should be free from superstition, meaning she should rely on practical knowledge rather than just magical thinking, though he doesn't dismiss the comfort of ritual entirely. She should have delicate hands, long, slim fingers, short nails. She should be calm, unflappable, able to reassure and encourage. Cyrannus describes the ideal birthing room, warm but well ventilated, with soft light, with materials at hand including olive oil, warm water, soft cloths, sponges, pillows, and a birth stool. He explains how midwives should support the laboring woman, how they should examine her to check the baby's position, how they should time contractions and assess progress. He even describes appropriate conversation, the words of encouragement a midwife should offer. Was this how all Greek midwives practiced? Probably not. Cyrannus was describing an ideal, and he was writing for a wealthy urban audience. Rural midwives, poor midwives, they worked with what they had, as midwives always have. But the fact that such a detailed text exists tells us that midwifery was understood as a skilled practice requiring training and judgment. Plato himself, in his dialogue, Theaetetus uses midwifery as a metaphor for Socratic teaching. Socrates' mother, he tells us, was a midwife, and Socrates describes his own philosophical method as midwifery of ideas. He draws out truth from his students, the way midwives draw out babies, with patience and skill. It's a compliment, this comparison. It acknowledges midwives as practitioners of a valuable art. Greek mythology gave midwives divine patronage to Artemis, virgin goddess of the hunt, was also a goddess of childbirth. Having helped her mother Leto give birth to her twin brother, Apollo. Women called on Artemis during labor, and midwives worked under her protection. Finally, let us step into ancient Rome, that vast empire that swallowed the Mediterranean world and left its mark on everything that came after. Roman society was patriarchal to its core, yet even Rome needed midwives. They were called obstetresses, a word that survives in our modern term, obstetrics, though the meaning has shifted from the woman who assists to the medical specialty itself. Roman midwives attended births across all social classes. Wealthy women had skilled, perhaps enslaved or freedwoman midwives who lived in the household or were called when labor began. Poor women had local midwives, women from their own neighborhoods who learned the craft through apprenticeship. Roman midwives, like their Greek counterparts, used birth stools, upright positions, massage, and herbal remedies. They knew how to manage hemorrhage, how to extract a placenta that didn't come on its own, how to perform version. Some Roman midwives became famous, at least within their communities. We know the name of Scribonia Attis, who attended births in Rome and whose skills were praised in writing. We know of others through tombstone inscriptions, where their profession is recorded as a source of pride. Here lies so-and-so, midwife, mother, freedwoman, mourned by all who knew her skill. The Romans, practical people that they were, understood that good midwives made economic sense. Slave-owning households wanted midwives who could successfully deliver enslaved women's babies, increasing the household's human property. Elite families wanted midwives who could safely deliver heirs. The empire itself had an interest in population, in citizens and soldiers, in the endless birth and rebirth that kept the machine running, and so midwives persisted through Mesopotamia and Egypt, Greece and Rome, through all the ancient civilizations that rose and fell like tides. They were there at the center of the most fundamental human experience, catching babies, saving lives, passing knowledge from experienced hands to learning ones. They were not always honored, not always remembered, but they were always necessary. Now breathe deeply, dear listener. Feel yourself floating on the current of history. We've traveled so far already, and we have so much further to go. But rest for a moment here in the ancient world, where goddesses watched over birth and women's hands knew what to do. Rest and gather strength, because the story ahead grows more complicated, more painful in places. Though ultimately no less remarkable, the knowledge continues. The hands continue, and we will follow them forward into the medieval world and beyond. Medieval midwives, between reverence and suspicion, let us step forward now, through the mists of time, to an era when midwives stood at a crossroads between honor and danger. The ancient world has fallen. Rome, that seemingly eternal empire, collapsed under the weight of its own complexity and the pressure of migrations and invasions. In its wake came what we call the Middle Ages, that 1,000-year span of European history, from roughly 500 to 1500 CE, a time of tremendous change, of faith and feudalism, of plague and crusades, of cathedrals rising toward heaven and villages huddled in their shadows. Picture a medieval village, not the romantic fantasy of storybooks, but the real, muddy, smoky, close-quartered reality. Houses of wattle and daub, with thatched roofs, clustered around a church and a manor. Fields beyond, divided into strips. Forest beyond that, dark and deep. Life here is short and hard. Infant mortality is staggering. Women often die in childbirth. Disease is common. Harvests fail. Winters are bitter. And yet life persists. Babies are born. And when they are born, it is almost always a midwife who is there. Medieval midwives were central figures in their communities. Everyone knew the local midwife. You might know her as Marjorie the midwife, or Old Joan who catches babies, or sometimes just by her first name. Because in this world, before surnames were universal, occupation often defined identity. She might be a widow, past childbearing age herself, respected for her years and experience. Or she might be younger, trained by her mother or another midwife, gradually taking over the practice as the older woman's hands grew too stiff or her eyes too dim. She lived among the people she served. She knew them, knew their families, knew who had difficult births and who delivered easily, knew family patterns of twins or breech babies. When a woman's time came, someone would fetch her, day or night, rain or snow. She would gather her bag, perhaps a basket containing herbs, cloths, a birthing stool if she had one, maybe a small knife for cutting the cord, a little olive oil or rendered fat, and she would go. Medieval birth took place at home, always. The woman's home, or sometimes her mother's home, if she had returned there for her lying in. The room would be prepared, a good fire to keep it warm, clean linens, if available, water heating, candles lit. Other women would come too. The laboring woman's mother, perhaps, sisters, female neighbors, and friends. Birth was a communal event, a women's mystery, and men were strictly excluded. The husband waited outside or busied himself elsewhere. This was not his realm. The midwife took charge. She assessed the labor's progress with experienced hands, feeling the belly to determine the baby's position, perhaps examining internally to check dilation. She encouraged the laboring woman to walk if labor was early, to rest if she was exhausted, to try different positions as things progressed. She knew tricks, having the woman kneel or squat, supporting her from behind, using a birthing stool with its U-shaped seat that allowed the baby to emerge while the woman remained upright, gravity assisting. She offered her remedies too, a tea made from raspberry leaves to strengthen contractions, ergot, that strange fungus that grows on rye, which could stop hemorrhaging but was dangerous in the wrong dose, poppy syrup for unbearable pain, though used sparingly because it could slow labor, oil of roses rubbed on the belly and thighs, prayers and charms, because in this world the spiritual and physical were inseparable. The midwife might invoke Saint Margaret, patron saint of childbirth, or recite the Ave Maria, or even use older charms, bits of pre-Christian tradition that persisted like underground streams beneath the surface of official religion. She talked the woman through it, her voice steady, reassuring. "You're doing well. Breathe now. The baby is coming. Not long now. I can see the head. One more push. Good. Here comes your child." And when the baby emerged, slippery and crying or ominously silent, the midwife caught it, cleared its airway, assessed it quickly with expert eyes. Was it breathing? Was its color good? Did it seem healthy and whole? She cut the cord, tied it off, wrapped the baby in cloth. If it wasn't breathing, she knew things to try, clearing the mouth and nose again, blowing gently into its face, rubbing its chest and back, even holding it upside down and tapping its feet. Not all babies could be saved, but she tried. Then came the afterbirth, the placenta, and this was a dangerous time too. Hemorrhage could kill in minutes. The midwife massaged the belly, encouraged the woman to push again, delivered the placenta, and examined it carefully to ensure it was complete. She knew that retained placenta tissue meant infection and death. She would pack the vagina with cloth if bleeding was heavy, administer her strongest herbs if mother and baby survived. And most times they did, though by no means always. The midwife stayed for hours more. She washed the baby. Sometimes the first bath involved salt or wine, traditional protection against evil. She helped the mother deliver the baby to breast for its first feeding. She cleaned up the bloody cloths and birth fluids, disposed of the afterbirth, buried, burned, or sometimes delivered to the church for blessing. Practices varied. She instructed the mother on care of herself and the newborn. She would return daily for several days, checking that the mother's womb was contracting properly, that her milk was coming in, that the baby was nursing well, that no fever had set in. For this work, she was paid. Not richly, for most people in medieval villages had little money. Payment might be in coin if the family had it, but just as often in kind: a chicken, a sack of grain, a wheel of cheese, a length of cloth, labor in her own garden, or help repairing her cottage. The lord's lady or wealthy merchants might pay better, sometimes even handsomely, because everyone knew that a skilled midwife was worth her weight in silver, and midwives were skilled. They had to be. Their training was entirely practical, learned through apprenticeship and observation. A young woman interested in midwifery, perhaps one who had shown aptitude helping at births, would attach herself to an experienced midwife, watching, assisting, gradually taking on more responsibility under supervision until she was deemed ready to practice independently. It might take years. There were no schools, no textbooks, no licenses in most places, though some larger towns began to require midwives to register with city authorities or be examined by male physicians. This requirement, appearing first in the 14th and 15th centuries, was an early sign of coming conflicts. Male physicians, educated at universities from which women were excluded, studying ancient texts and theoretical medicine, began to claim authority over what had always been women's domain. They couldn't attend births themselves, not yet. That remained women's business. But they could set standards, examine midwives on their knowledge, approve or disapprove them. The church, too, took interest in midwives, though for different reasons. The medieval Catholic Church was deeply concerned with salvation, and babies who died unbaptized could not enter heaven according to official doctrine. They were condemned to limbo, that shadowy place of neither punishment nor reward. This was unbearable for believing parents, and so midwives were given a special responsibility. If a baby was in danger of dying, if the birth was going terribly wrong, the midwife was authorized to perform emergency baptism. She could speak the holy words, "I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit," words normally reserved for priests, and that baptism was considered valid. This gave midwives a unique spiritual status. They were the only laywomen authorized to perform a sacrament. It granted them a kind of religious authority, but it also put them under church scrutiny. They had to be examined by church officials, had to swear oaths that they knew the proper form of baptism, that they were good Christians, that they wouldn't practice magic or witchcraft. And here, dear listener, we begin to see the shadow falling. Because midwifery existed in a liminal space, a threshold space between life and death, between the physical and spiritual, between women's traditional knowledge and male institutional authority. Midwives attended the most vulnerable moments of life. They saw women naked and inexperienced. They dealt with blood and bodies, with birth waters and afterbirth, substances that made men uncomfortable, that were associated with female power and female mystery. They knew things too. They knew herbs that could bring on a late period, though officially such knowledge was forbidden because it might mean helping a woman end an unwanted pregnancy. They knew how to determine if a woman was truly pregnant or feigning it. They knew intimate things about women's bodies, secrets that women kept from their husbands and fathers. In a society that increasingly wanted to regulate and control female sexuality, midwives' knowledge was threatening. Moreover, midwifery was one of the few areas where women held expertise that men couldn't claim. Male physicians could theorize about birth, but they hadn't attended hundreds of deliveries. They hadn't felt with their own hands the 1,000 variations of normal birth. They hadn't developed the intuition that comes from years of practice, the ability to sense when something was going wrong before the obvious signs appeared. Midwives had this embodied knowledge, and it couldn't easily be taken from them or replicated by men who remained outside the birth room. So midwives in the late Middle Ages found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position, still necessary, still sought after, still respected by the women they served, but increasingly viewed with suspicion by male authorities, both religious and medical. They were being asked to prove themselves, to submit to examination, to restrict their practices to approved methods. The old ways, the grandmother's knowledge, the herbal lore and traditional techniques, these were being labeled as potentially dangerous, potentially heretical, potentially witchcraft. And the word witchcraft begins to appear more frequently in documents from the 14th and 15th centuries. The Church, fighting heresy and anxious about spiritual purity, began to see diabolic influence everywhere, and women who wielded power, especially power over life and death, were suspect. Not all midwives were accused of witchcraft. In fact, most were not, but the accusation was there, lurking, a possibility that must have haunted any woman who practiced the craft. Still, they continued, because babies continued to be born, because women in labor needed them, because the knowledge was precious and couldn't be allowed to die. Medieval midwives, caught between honor and suspicion, between traditional authority and emerging restrictions, carried on their work with whatever grace and courage they could muster, and the knowledge flowed forward, from experienced hands to learning ones, from one generation to the next, through the long medieval centuries and into the early modern world where, as we shall see, the situation would become even more dangerous, even more fraught. But that part of the story must wait. For now, rest here in the medieval village. Hear the church bell ringing the hours. Smell the wood smoke and the earth. Feel the weight of knowledge carried in capable hands. Knowledge that had already survived 1,000 years and would somehow survive 1,000 more. The witch hunts, when knowledge became dangerous, but there came a time dear listener, when the very knowledge that made midwives valuable also made them vulnerable. The late medieval period was giving way to the early modern era. Roughly 1450 to 1750, a time of tremendous upheaval. The printing press was invented, spreading ideas faster than ever before. The Protestant Reformation shattered the unity of Western Christianity. New continents were discovered by Europeans, though of course people already lived there. The scientific revolution was beginning, with men looking through telescopes and microscopes, questioning ancient authorities, seeking new ways of understanding the world. But alongside this intellectual ferment, there was terror. A terror that we now call the witch hunts, though it was many things: a moral panic, a persecution, a femicide, a manifestation of social anxiety turned murderous. Between roughly 1450 and 1750, somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe and European colonies. And perhaps 75 to 80% of them were women. Countless others were accused, imprisoned, tortured, but ultimately released or acquitted. Their lives destroyed, even if they escaped execution. The stereotype of the witch that emerged during this period is horribly familiar. An old woman, poor, quarrelsome, living alone or with only cats for company. Perhaps a bit strange, certainly not properly subordinate to male authority. A woman who cursed or threatened. A woman who knew too much about herbs or healing. A woman who was present when something went wrong. A cow died. A child fell ill. A harvest failed. A man became impotent. Correlation became causation in frightened minds. An accusation followed in Midwives. Dear God, midwives fit this profile in terrifying ways. Think about it from the perspective of a 16th century community gripped by belief in witchcraft. Midwives were present at births, and sometimes babies died. Sometimes mothers died. Sometimes babies were born deformed or stillborn. In a worldview that attributed such tragedies not to natural causes but to supernatural malice, who was the obvious suspect? The woman who was there, who had handled mother and baby with her hands, who had administered herbs and touched and whispered. Midwives knew about herbs, about substances that could ease pain or bring on labor or stop hemorrhaging. But some of those same herbs, in different doses or contexts, could harm. They could cause miscarriage. They could poison. In a culture increasingly anxious about women's sexuality, about illegitimate pregnancies, about the possibility that women might control their own fertility, this knowledge was suspect. A midwife who knew how to help might also know how to hurt. And once that possibility lodged in someone's mind, accusation could follow. The infamous Malleus, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1486 by two German inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, specifically targeted midwives. This vile text, which became a bestseller and a handbook for witch hunters, contains an entire section on midwife witches. It claimed that no one did more harm to the Catholic faith than midwives, that they offered newborns to demons, that they caused miscarriages and stillbirths through their malice, that they could prevent conception or cause impotence in men. None of this was true. Midwives were trying to save lives, not destroy them. But truth mattered little once the machinery of accusation began to turn. The Malleus provided theological justification for suspecting midwives, and it was read and believed by judges, priests, princes, and common folk across Europe. Let me tell you what could happen. A woman in labor struggles. Perhaps the baby is breech, or the labor is obstructed. The midwife does everything she knows, tries every technique, says every prayer. But the baby dies, or the mother dies, or both die. The family, wild with grief, looks for someone to blame. In a worldview that accepts witchcraft as real, natural tragedy becomes evidence of malice. The midwife, who stayed with them for hours or days, who tried so hard, becomes the accused. Or perhaps the accusation comes from rivalry. Another woman wants to be the local midwife, wants the income and the status. She whispers to neighbors that the established midwife uses strange herbs, says odd words, that babies seem to sicken after she touches them. Rumor spreads like plague. People remember the baby who died 6 months ago, the difficult birth last year. They reinterpret memory through the lens of suspicion, or perhaps the midwife has made enemies in other ways. She refused someone's request for an abortifacient herb, and that person now wants revenge. She was present at a birth that revealed adultery, the baby's appearance, made clear it couldn't be the husband's child, and now someone wants to silence her. She stood up for herself in a property dispute or spoke too sharply to someone more powerful. Witchcraft accusation becomes a weapon, a way to destroy a woman who has somehow stepped out of line. Once accused, the process was nightmarish. The accused might be arrested and imprisoned. In many places, torture was used to extract confessions. The tools of torture were ingenious in their cruelty. The strappado, where victims were hung by their wrists, tied behind their backs, shoulders dislocating under their own weight. The rack, stretching bodies until joints separated. Thumb screws and leg vices, crushing bones. Sleep deprivation, maintaining interrogation for days without rest. Under such conditions, people confessed to anything. They confessed to flying to Sabbaths on broomsticks, to copulating with demons, to eating babies, to causing storms and blights and diseases. They named accomplices, often other women in the community, spreading the net of accusation wider. And once a confession was extracted, execution followed, burning at the stake in some regions, hanging in others. Some midwives were indeed executed as witches. We know their names, some of them. Walpurga House Manon in Bavaria in 1587, tortured and burned, accused of killing infants and causing miscarriages through witchcraft. Agnes Sampson in Scotland in 1591, accused of witchcraft and treason, tortured with the pillowinks, thumbscrews, and the witch's bridle, eventually strangled and burned. Countless others, whose names were recorded only in trial documents, or not recorded at all. But here is what we must understand and hold gently in our hearts as we contemplate this dark period. Most midwives were never accused. Most continued their work, year after year, attending births, saving lives, passing knowledge to the next generation. The witch hunts were sporadic and localized, intense in some regions and time periods, barely present in others. A midwife in England in 1550 might live her entire life without accusation. A midwife in Germany in 1630 might live in constant fear, and even during the worst periods, communities still needed midwives. Babies didn't stop being born because of moral panic. Women in labor didn't suddenly know how to manage on their own. So, even in the heart of witch-hunting regions, even when fear was at its peak, midwives continued. They were more careful, perhaps. They insisted on witnesses to their actions. They were more willing to submit to examination by authorities, to prove they knew the proper baptismal formula, to demonstrate that they used approved methods. Some withdrew from the more controversial aspects of their practice. They refused to provide herbs that might be used to end pregnancy, even when a desperate woman begged. They avoided anything that might look like magic, sticking to techniques that could be explained as purely practical. They became more orthodox, more conventional, sacrificing some of the old knowledge to survive. But they survived. Not all of them, and certainly not without cost. The witch hunts cast a long shadow over women's healing practices, over midwifery, over any domain where women held expertise and authority. The message was clear. Women's power was dangerous. Women's knowledge was suspect. Women needed to be controlled by male, religious, and medical authority. Yet the knowledge persisted, because it had to, because it was too valuable to lose entirely, because women kept seeking out skilled midwives despite the risks, because midwives themselves, those brave and stubborn women, refused to let centuries of accumulated wisdom die. Some of them wrote their knowledge down during this period, though literacy was not universal. In 1540, Eucharius Raslin published a midwifery manual in Germany, based heavily on ancient sources but also incorporating contemporary practice. Though written by a man, it was used by midwives. Later, women began to publish their own texts. Louise Bourgeois in France, in 1609, published observations on her midwifery practice, including attendants at the birth of the future Louis XIII. These texts preserved knowledge and lent legitimacy to midwifery as a skilled practice, not mere superstition. The church and secular authorities, even while maintaining suspicion, recognized that they needed to regulate midwifery rather than destroy it. Licensing became more common. Midwives were examined, required to demonstrate knowledge and moral character, required to swear oaths. This was control, yes, an assertion of male authority over women's practice. But it was also a kind of recognition, an admission that midwifery was necessary and required skill. And gradually, very gradually, the worst of the witch hunts subsided. By the early 18th century, executions for witchcraft became rarer. Enlightenment ideas about reason and evidence, ironically, often wielded against women in other contexts, made the witch trials seem barbaric and irrational. The last legal execution for witchcraft in Europe occurred in 1782 in Switzerland. Though lynchings and accusations continued longer in some places, midwives emerged from this dark period scarred but surviving. They had learned to be more cautious, more deferential to authority. They had lost some knowledge, some confidence. The easy assumption that women's expertise in women's matters was natural and unquestionable had been shattered. Male medical authority had been asserted, and would continue to advance in the centuries ahead. But the midwives were still there, still attending births, still catching babies with skilled hands, still passing knowledge from one generation to the next. The witch hunts had tried to frighten them into submission or silence them entirely, but they hadn't succeeded. The craft, the calling, the essential work continued. So breathe now, dear listener. That was a dark passage, and I'm sorry to have taken you through it, but it's part of the story, and we can't understand the resilience of midwifery without understanding what it survived. rest a moment. Feel your own body, safe and whole. Remember that you are not in that time, that the terror has passed, that we're simply bearing witness from a distance, honoring those who suffered while celebrating those who endured. The story continues forward into new challenges, new threats to midwifery, but also new forms of persistence and ultimately renewal. We're not done yet. The knowledge survives and will follow it onward. The medicalization of birth, a profession, under siege as centuries turned and science began to claim authority over all things. Birth became a battleground. We're moving now into the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, an age of revolution and industry, of empire and enlightenment, of tremendous confidence in human reason and progress. Medicine was transforming from an art based on ancient texts and tradition into something that claimed to be truly scientific, grounded in anatomy and observation, in experiment and evidence. This should have been good for midwives. After all, they had centuries of observational knowledge, of hands-on experience with birth in all its variations. They knew what worked and what didn't, not from reading Galen or Hippocrates, but from being present at hundreds or thousands of births. If medicine was now to be based on observation and experience, surely midwives had those in abundance. But that's not what happened. Instead, birth became one more arena where male physicians, armed with university educations and claims to scientific authority, began to push women aside. The midwife, who had attended birth since the beginning of human time, suddenly found herself characterized as ignorant, superstitious, old-fashioned, dangerous. The male physician, who often had never attended a birth before graduating medical school, was presented as modern, rational, scientific, safe. Let us understand how this happened, because it wasn't inevitable. It was a choice, or rather a series of choices, made by institutions and individuals, choices shaped by assumptions about gender, knowledge, and authority. The story often begins with the forceps. In the 17th century, the Chamberlain family in England developed obstetrical forceps, a tool that could be inserted around a baby's head during a difficult birth and used to pull the baby through the birth canal. This was potentially life-saving in cases of obstructed labor where the baby was stuck and both mother and child were in mortal danger. But here's the thing. The Chamberlains kept their invention secret for nearly a century. They were male barber surgeons who attended difficult births, and they wanted to maintain their monopoly on this miraculous tool. They would arrive at a birth in crisis, demand that everyone leave the room, cover the laboring woman's lower body with blankets so she couldn't see what they were doing, and deploy their secret forceps. Sometimes they saved lives. Sometimes they caused terrible damage, crushing or tearing. But in the desperation of a death-threatening birth, people were willing to accept high risks. Eventually, the secret got out, and by the 18th century, forceps were known and used by male physicians throughout Europe and America. And here's where things shifted, because now men had a tool that midwives didn't have access to. Medical schools and medical guilds, which excluded women, began training male physicians in forceps use. The logic went, difficult births require forceps. Forceps require training. Only men can get that training. Therefore, men should attend births. Never mind that most births weren't difficult and didn't need forceps. Never mind that midwives had been managing difficult births for centuries using positioning, patience, and skill. Never mind that in many cases, forceps were used unnecessarily, even harmfully, because a physician wanted to speed up a birth or demonstrate his skill. The forceps became a symbol of male medical authority, a tool that justified men's presence in the birth room. And men did begin entering birth rooms, especially in wealthier households. In the 18th century, particularly in France and England, it became fashionable among upper-class women to be attended by a male physician rather than a midwife. A man midwife, or accoucheur, the French term, was a status symbol, a sign that your family could afford the best modern care. These male practitioners often had very little practical experience. They learned about birth from books and lectures, perhaps observed a few deliveries, and then set up practice. They approached birth as a medical event, something to be managed and controlled, rather than a normal physiological process that needed support. They were more likely to intervene, to use forceps or other instruments, to hurry things along. And here is the bitter irony: for much of the 18th and 19th centuries, having a physician attend your birth was actually more dangerous than having a midwife. Not because physicians weren't intelligent or well-meaning, but because they didn't understand infection. Let me take you to Vienna in the 1840s, to the obstetrical clinic, where medical students trained. The clinic had two divisions, one staffed by midwives, one by physicians and medical students. Both served poor women who gave birth there in exchange for being teaching cases. And women in the physician-staffed division were dying of puerperal fever, childbed fever, at rates 5 times higher than in the midwife-staffed division. The women knew it. They begged not to be assigned to the physician's division. They would rather give birth in the street than go there. But no one in authority understood why. Then came Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian physician working in the clinic. He observed, he questioned, he tested hypotheses, and he realized the physicians and students were performing autopsies in the morning, then attending births in the afternoon without properly washing their hands. They were carrying cadaveric particles, infectious material from dead bodies, directly into the birth canal of laboring women. The midwives, who didn't perform autopsies, weren't carrying this contamination. Semmelweis instituted a policy of hand-washing with chlorinated lime solution before examining patients. Deaths in the physician's division plummeted. He had discovered the importance of antisepsis before germ theory was established, simply through careful observation. But his colleagues didn't believe him. They were offended by the suggestion that physicians, gentlemen, were causing deaths. They rejected his findings, and Semmelweis, frustrated and increasingly erratic, ended his life in a mental institution. It would take decades, and the work of Pasteur and Lister and others establishing germ theory, before the medical establishment accepted that physicians' hands could kill. Meanwhile, midwives, who had always washed their hands because they empirically knew cleanliness mattered, who attended one birth at a time rather than rushing from autopsy to delivery, who used their hands and patience rather than instruments, continued to have better outcomes for normal births. But this didn't stop the advance of male medical authority. Throughout the 19th century, in Europe and America, midwifery came increasingly under attack. Medical journals published articles claiming that midwives were ignorant and dangerous. Medical associations lobbied for laws restricting midwifery practice or requiring midwives to work under physician supervision. Medical schools, still closed to women, produced more and more male physicians who claimed expertise in obstetrics. Some physicians were honest about their motivations. They saw obstetrics as a way to build a practice. If you attended a woman's birth, you might become the physician for her whole family, a source of ongoing income. Midwives, who traditionally only attended births and perhaps provided some postpartum care, didn't threaten other areas of medical practice. But if you let midwives keep birth, physicians argued, you lost that entry point into families. Economic motivation, then, not just scientific authority or concern for women's welfare. This was about professional territory and income. Women were increasingly barred from medical education during this period, even as medicine was professionalizing. In the early modern period, some women had learned medicine through apprenticeship or family tradition, practicing as healers and midwives. But as formal medical education became the requirement for practice, and as universities and medical schools excluded women, female practitioners were pushed out. There were exceptions. Brave women who fought for medical education. Elizabeth Blackwell in America, graduating from medical school in 1849. The first woman in the United States to receive a medical degree. Sophia Jex-Blake in Britain, fighting for women's admission to medical schools in the 1860s and 70s. These women faced incredible opposition, harassment from male students and faculty, legal challenges, social censure. But they persisted, and some of them specifically championed midwifery and women's health care. They understood that women patients often preferred female practitioners, especially for intimate matters like birth. They argued that women physicians and trained midwives provided better care because they understood women's bodies and experiences in ways male physicians couldn't. But they were swimming against a powerful current, the professionalization of medicine, which in many ways improved healthcare through standardization and scientific grounding, was also deeply gendered. It assumed that scientific knowledge was masculine, that authority was masculine, that the proper place for women was as patients or as nurses supporting male physicians, not as autonomous practitioners. Midwives were increasingly regulated, required to register and be examined, limited in what they could do. In some places, they were forbidden to use instruments or administer medications, which meant they had to call a physician in emergencies, ceding authority and control. In some places, midwifery training was provided, but it was often cursory compared to medical education, and it positioned midwives as assistants to physicians rather than independent practitioners. The situation varied by country and region. In France, midwifery schools continued to train skilled midwives throughout the 19th century, and midwives retained a respected place in the healthcare system. In Scandinavia, similar patterns held. In Germany and the Netherlands, midwives remained primary birth attendants for much of the population. But in Britain, and especially in America, midwifery was under sustained attack. By the early 20th century in America, campaigns against midwifery were explicit and vicious. Public health officials, many of them male physicians, blamed midwives for high infant and maternal mortality rates, even though the evidence suggested that physician-attended births had equal or higher mortality, especially when you controlled for the fact that physicians were more likely to be called to complicated cases. Midwives were characterized in racist and classist terms. Immigrant midwives, who served immigrant communities in cities, were described as dirty and ignorant. Black midwives in the South, who served black communities in a segregated healthcare system, were similarly maligned. The fact that these communities trusted and relied on their midwives, that these women had deep knowledge and skill, was dismissed. States began passing laws restricting or outlawing midwifery. Some required midwives to have medical licenses, which meant medical education, which was largely unavailable to women and completely unavailable to women of color. It was a backdoor way of eliminating midwifery without having to explicitly ban it, and it worked to a horrifying degree. By the mid-20th century in America, midwife-attended births had dropped from the majority to a tiny minority. Most births took place in hospitals, attended by physicians, often with heavy intervention, routine forceps, routine episiotomy, cutting the perineum, heavy sedation, separation of mother and baby after birth. Birth had been fully medicalized, transformed from a normal life event into a medical procedure requiring expert management. Women lost choice and autonomy. They labored alone in hospital rooms, often with their hands strapped down, drugged into twilight sleep where they experienced pain but didn't remember it. Their babies extracted with forceps and taken to nurseries. They were told this was modern, this was safe, this was scientific progress. And for some women, especially those with genuine medical complications, hospital birth with physician attendants was life-saving. Medical advances in managing hemorrhage, eclampsia, infection, and other serious conditions did reduce maternal mortality over the 20th century. No one can deny that, but for most women, with normal, healthy pregnancies and births, the medicalization of birth meant unnecessary intervention, loss of control, and separation from the traditional support of other women. The knowledge that midwives held, the patient, watchful approach of supporting normal birth rather than managing it, the emotional and spiritual dimensions of birth. These were devalued and nearly lost, nearly, but not entirely, because even as mainstream medicine pushed midwives to the margins, the midwives persisted. Some practiced quietly, serving communities that wanted them. Some fought back, organizing, advocating, insisting that they had valuable knowledge and that women deserved choices in birth care. And slowly, very slowly, the tide would begin to turn again. But that part of the story must wait for the next section. For now, rest here in this uncomfortable knowledge. The medicalization of birth was not purely about science or safety. It was also about power, about professional territory, about deeply held assumptions regarding whose knowledge counted and who had authority over women's bodies. It was about the systematically silencing of women's expertise and the elevation of male institutional authority. Hold this tension gently as you drift. Honor the real medical advances that saved lives, yes, but also honor the midwives who were pushed aside, whose knowledge was dismissed, who kept practicing anyway because they knew their worth and because the women they served needed them. The story isn't over. The knowledge survived, and we're going to follow it forward into renewal and resistance. Pioneers and reformers, reclaiming the profession, yet even as midwifery seemed to fade into history's margins, there were those who refused to let it go. In the early 20th century, even as American medicine was systematically eliminating midwives, even as hospitals were becoming the default place for birth, some women looked at what was happening and said, "No, this is wrong. We're losing something valuable. We need to fight back." These were the pioneers and reformers, women who saw that the medicalization of birth had gone too far, that it was harming women and babies rather than helping them, that the knowledge midwives held was precious and needed to be preserved and renewed. They came from different backgrounds, had different strategies, but they shared a common conviction: midwifery mattered, and women deserved better birth care. Let me introduce you to some of them. Let their stories fill your mind as you drift toward sleep. Stories of determination and vision, of women who saw what needed to be done and then did it, despite enormous obstacles. First, Mary Breckinridge. Born in 1881 to a wealthy Kentucky family, she had every privilege, every comfort. She could have lived a life of ease and social pleasantness. But tragedy struck twice. Her husband died, then her 2 young children died. Grief could have destroyed her. Instead, it transformed her. She became a nurse, then trained as a midwife in England, where midwifery was still a respected profession. She worked in France after World War I, caring for refugees and displaced families. And she saw how midwives made a difference, how they provided essential care to mothers and babies, especially in rural areas far from hospitals. Then she came home to Kentucky and looked at the Appalachian Mountains, at the remote communities scattered through those hills and hollows, at the grinding poverty and isolation, at mothers dying in childbirth and babies dying in infancy at rates far higher than the national average. These communities had no hospitals, no doctors, no professional health care at all. Just traditional granny midwives, local women who did their best with limited knowledge and no supplies. Mary Breckinridge decided to do something about it. In 1925, she founded the Frontier Nursing Service, bringing trained nurse midwives to the Kentucky mountains. She recruited nurses from across America and from Britain, women who would ride horses through mountain paths to reach isolated families, carrying saddlebags full of supplies. She established outpost clinics in local communities. She created a hospital where complicated cases could be transported, and it worked. The Frontier Nursing Service provided care to thousands of families. They attended home births, provided prenatal care, cared for sick children, treated injuries and illnesses, served as the primary health care for entire communities, and their outcomes were remarkable. Maternal mortality in their service area dropped to rates far below the national average. Infant mortality plummeted. These nurse midwives, working in conditions that would have daunted most physicians, were saving lives through skill, dedication, and the midwifery model of care. Mary Breckinridge didn't just create a service. She created a model and a legacy. The Frontier Nursing Service still exists today, still serving rural Kentucky. And she inspired generations of nurse midwives who saw that midwifery could be professional, could be excellent, could provide better care than the dominant medical model in many situations. Now let us cross the ocean to Britain, where midwifery never died, but was also under pressure. British midwives had to fight repeatedly throughout the 20th century to maintain their autonomy and to professional status against physicians who wanted to subordinate them. In 1902, Britain passed the Midwives Act, which required midwives to be certified and registered, establishing standards and protecting the title midwife, so that anyone calling themselves a midwife had to meet those standards. This was a victory, a recognition that midwifery was a legitimate profession requiring training and skill, but it was also a compromise. Midwives were regulated by the Central Midwives Board, which included physicians, so male medical authority had oversight. Midwives were expected to call a physician in abnormal cases, even though defining abnormal was contested territory. And as the 20th century progressed, as more births moved to hospitals in Britain as in America, midwives had to fight to maintain their role. British midwives organized, they formed professional associations, they advocated for their scope of practice, they insisted that midwifery was a distinct profession, not merely obstetric nursing. They defended home birth as a legitimate choice, and they largely succeeded. Today, midwifery remains a strong autonomous profession in Britain, with midwives providing primary care for most births, even those in hospitals. The struggle was similar in other European countries, in Scandinavia, in the Netherlands, where midwives fought to maintain their professional standing and their model of care. In the Netherlands, especially, midwives won. Home birth, attended by midwives, remained the cultural norm well into the late 20th century, with hospital birth reserved for cases with medical complications. Dutch outcomes for mothers and babies were excellent, demonstrating that the midwifery model worked. Back in America, midwifery was nearly extinct by mid-century, but not quite. Traditional midwives continued practicing in some communities, especially in the rural South, attending births for black families who had no access to segregated hospitals or couldn't afford physician care. These granny midwives or lay midwives were often elderly, black women who learned the craft from their mothers or grandmothers, who attended births for little or no money, who were pillars of their communities. They were under constant pressure from public health authorities who wanted to eliminate them. Southern states in the early 20th century launched campaigns to regulate or eliminate granny midwives, often using explicitly racist language about their supposed ignorance. But these midwives persisted because they were needed and wanted. Their communities trusted them. Some of these traditional midwives are remembered by name. Maud Callan in South Carolina, who practiced from the 1920s through the 1970s, attending thousands of births, providing health care to black families, becoming legendary in her community. When Life magazine published a photo essay about her in 1951, donations poured in from around the country, allowing her to build a clinic. Then came the 1970s, and everything began to shift again. The women's movement, the counterculture, the growing skepticism about medical authority, the desire for more natural and holistic approaches to health. All of these created space for a midwifery revival. Women began questioning the highly medicalized hospital birth that had become standard. They read books like Spiritual Midwifery by Ina May Gaskin, published in 1975, which described births at a hippie commune in Tennessee where Ina May, a self-taught midwife with no formal training, attended home births with beautiful outcomes and deep respect for the birth process. They learned about the excellent outcomes in countries like the Netherlands, where midwives attended most births. They pointed to studies showing that for low-risk pregnancies, midwife-attended births had equal or better outcomes than physician-attended births. With far less intervention, women wanted choices. They wanted to give birth without routine episiotomy, without being strapped to a bed and denied food and water, without automatic separation from their babies. They wanted continuous support during labor, something midwives provided, but hospital nurses, responsible for multiple patients, often couldn't. They wanted someone who viewed birth as a normal physiological process rather than a medical emergency waiting to happen. And so midwifery began to revive. Nurse midwifery education programs, which had nearly disappeared, began to grow. Women became certified nurse midwives, CNMs, advanced practice nurses with specialized training in midwifery. They fought for hospital privileges, for the right to practice, for insurance reimbursement, and a different path emerged to direct entry midwifery, where women trained specifically as midwives without first becoming nurses. More similar to the traditional apprenticeship model, these midwives, who might be called certified professional midwives, CPMs, or licensed midwives, LMIs, depending on jurisdiction, primarily attended home births and births in freestanding birth centers. The struggle for recognition and legitimacy was immense. The medical establishment fought back. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, state legislatures debated laws about midwifery scope of practice. Insurance companies refused to cover midwife-attended births or required physician collaboration that was sometimes impossible to obtain. Midwives were arrested for practicing medicine without a license. Home birth midwives especially faced legal jeopardy in states that criminalized their practice. But they kept going, supported by families who wanted them, by communities that valued them, and slowly, the evidence accumulated. Study after study showed that midwifery care, particularly for low-risk pregnancies, was safe and effective. Large-scale reviews demonstrated that midwife-attended births had lower rates of intervention, lower rates of cesarean section, equal or better outcomes for mothers and babies, and higher patient satisfaction. International organizations recognized this. The World Health Organization endorsed midwifery as essential to reducing maternal and infant mortality worldwide. Countries with strong midwifery systems had the best birth outcomes. Countries that had eliminated midwifery, like America, had worse outcomes despite spending far more on healthcare by the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Midwifery was experiencing a genuine renaissance. Younger generations of midwives were being trained. Research was being conducted. Professional organizations were advocating effectively. And, crucially, women were demanding access to midwifery care. Birth centers, home-like facilities staffed by midwives, where women could labor and give birth without routine medical intervention, began opening. Some hospitals developed midwifery services, allowing midwives to attend births in hospital settings. Home birth, while still a small minority of births, became a legal and accessible option in more places. Indigenous midwifery also experienced renewal. Native American communities, First Nations in Canada, Indigenous peoples worldwide who had seen their traditional birth practices suppressed by colonial medical systems, began reclaiming them. Indigenous midwives were trained or retrained, blending traditional knowledge with contemporary skills. Programs were established to allow Indigenous women to give birth in their communities, attended by Indigenous midwives, rather than being forced to travel to distant hospitals. This was about more than healthcare. It was about cultural survival, about reclaiming sovereignty over bodies and births, about healing historical trauma. And it was led by indigenous women who refused to let their traditions die. All of these pioneers and reformers, from Mary Breckinridge in the 1920s to contemporary indigenous midwives, shared something essential. They believed that midwifery mattered. They believed that women deserved respectful, individualized care during birth. They believed that the knowledge midwives held was valuable and needed to be preserved, practiced, and passed on. They fought not for glory, but for the right to serve. They endured opposition and skepticism, legal challenges, and professional obstacles. They worked long hours for modest pay because they were called to the work. They caught babies and supported mothers and knew, deep in their bones, that what they did mattered. If their stories move you, let me know in the comments. And share this with someone who might need to hear it tonight. Share it with someone who is pregnant or has given birth. With someone who loves history or women's stories. With someone who needs to know that resistance and persistence can change the world. Now rest, dear dreamer. Feel the strength of these women flowing through time toward you. They didn't give up, and because they didn't, midwifery survived. The knowledge continues. The hands that catch babies reach forward through generations, and they're still reaching, still catching, still caring. Modern midwifery, ancient wisdom meets modern Quran now. Dear dreamer, we arrive at today, where the ancient art of midwifery breathes still, transformed by time, but recognizable in its essence. If you could step into a contemporary birth attended by a midwife, what would you see? How has this profession, this calling, this knowledge that stretches back to the beginning of human time, manifested itself in our modern world? The answer is wonderfully complex, beautifully diverse. Modern midwifery exists in many forms, adapted to different healthcare systems, different cultures, different regulatory environments, different philosophies of care. But threaded through all these variations is something consistent, something that connects today's midwives to their ancestors across the centuries, a belief that birth is a normal physiological process, that women's bodies know how to give birth, that the role of the birth attendant is to support and facilitate rather than to manage and control. Let us look first at the different types of midwives practicing today, because this itself tells a story about how the profession has adapted and persisted in the United States. Certified nurse midwives, CNMs, are advanced practice registered nurses who have completed graduate-level midwifery education. They are licensed to practice in all 50 states. Can prescribe medications, can attend births in hospitals or birth centers or homes, and provide comprehensive women's health care beyond just pregnancy and birth, annual exams, contraception, menopause care. There are roughly 13,000 CNMs in America today, a small number compared to obstetricians, but growing steadily. Then there are certified professional midwives, who train through direct entry programs rather than nursing school, learning midwifery specifically rather than nursing plus midwifery. They primarily attend home births and births in freestanding birth centers. Their legal status varies by state. Some states license them. Some explicitly outlaw their practice. Some exist in legal gray areas. There are perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 CPMs practicing in America. Internationally, the picture is different. In Britain, midwives are the primary maternity care providers, attending the majority of births, whether at home, in birth centers, or in hospitals. British midwifery is a 3-year undergraduate program separate from nursing, producing autonomous practitioners. Most British women will see a midwife for all their prenatal care and will have a midwife attend their birth, with an obstetrician involved only if complications develop. The Netherlands has perhaps the strongest midwifery system in the developed world. Dutch midwives attend over half of all births, with home birth remaining a common choice. The system assumes that pregnancy and birth are normal unless proven otherwise. So women begin care with midwives and transfer to obstetricians only if risk factors develop. Dutch outcomes for mothers and babies are excellent, consistently among the best in the world. In Scandinavia, similar patterns hold. Sweden, Norway, Denmark, all have strong midwifery professions integrated into public healthcare systems. Canada is somewhere between the American and European models, with midwifery legal and growing, but still a relatively small part of the maternity care system. In developing countries, the picture is mixed. Traditional birth attendants, women who learn midwifery through apprenticeship in their communities, attend a large percentage of births in rural areas where access to hospitals and trained healthcare providers is limited. International organizations have worked to train these traditional midwives in hygiene, recognition of complications, and basic skills, with mixed results. The goal is to preserve the cultural appropriateness and accessibility of traditional midwifery, while improving safety. But there's also been a push to train professional midwives in developing countries, women who receive formal midwifery education and can provide skilled care in community settings. The evidence is overwhelming. In places where skilled midwives are available and empowered to practice their full scope, maternal and infant mortality dropped dramatically. Midwifery is one of the most cost-effective interventions for improving birth outcomes, particularly in resource-limited settings. So what does modern midwifery care actually look like? What happens when you choose a midwife? It begins with prenatal care. Midwifery prenatal visits tend to be longer than typical obstetric appointments, often 30 minutes to an hour. The midwife takes time to answer questions, to discuss not just physical health, but emotional well-being, nutrition, exercise, preparation for birth, and parenting. She examines you, checks your blood pressure and the baby's heartbeat, measures your belly, orders necessary tests. But she also listens, really listens, building a relationship that will carry through labor and birth. Midwives tend to have lower caseloads than obstetricians, allowing for this individualized attention. In ideal circumstances, you see the same midwife or small group of midwives throughout pregnancy, so that when you go into labor, you're attended by someone who knows you, who has earned your trust. When labor begins, if you're planning a home birth, the midwife comes to you. She brings her supplies, a Doppler or fetoscope to monitor the baby's heartbeat, blood pressure cuff, oxygen, medications for hemorrhage, equipment for newborn resuscitation, sterile gloves and drapes, herbs and homeopathics if she uses them. She settles in, assessing you and the baby, supporting you through contractions, offering suggestions for comfort and labor progress. If you're giving birth in a hospital or birth center, the midwife meets you there or is already present. The environment varies. Birth centers aim for home-like settings with comfortable furniture, tubs for water labor, freedom to move and eat and drink. Hospitals vary tremendously, from restrictive policies requiring continuous monitoring and limiting position choices to more flexible approaches that allow midwives to practice their full model of care throughout labor. The midwife's approach is watchful waiting. She monitors you and the baby, checking vital signs regularly, listening to the baby's heart rate, assessing labor progress. But she doesn't rush. She trusts the process. She knows that labor unfolds in its own time, that every birth is unique, that interventions should be used judiciously only when genuinely needed. She offers continuous support, something that research has shown makes an enormous difference in birth outcomes and satisfaction. She stays with you, offering comfort measures, massage, counter pressure for back labor, hot or cold compresses, guidance in breathing and vocalization, suggestions for position changes that might help labor progress, encouragement and reassurance. She's comfortable with mess and intimacy, with blood and fluids, with women's bodies in their raw power. She doesn't flinch at the sounds you make, the way you move, the intensity of your experience. She holds space for the enormity of birth, the way it strips away pretense and exposes essential humanity when the baby comes. She catches it with practiced hands, the same motion midwives have made across millennia. She places the baby on your chest, skin to skin, delayed cord clamping, allowing blood to flow from placenta to baby for optimal transition. She assesses the baby while it's with you. No need for immediate separation unless there's a problem. She supports that first latch if you're breastfeeding, guides the baby to your breast, shows you how to help the baby learn. She delivers the placenta, massages your uterus to control bleeding, examines you for tears and repairs them if necessary. Though midwife-tended births tend to have lower rates of severe tearing because midwives use techniques to protect the perineum, warm compresses, controlled delivery of the head, patience, and then she stays for hours if it's a home birth, cleaning up, ensuring you're stable, helping you to the bathroom for that first tender postpartum pee, making sure the baby is nursing well, teaching your partner how to care for you both, tucking you into bed before she leaves. She returned the next day and the day after, checking on healing, on breastfeeding, on emotional adjustment, providing postpartum care that extends weeks beyond the birth. This is the midwifery model of care: holistic, individualized, continuous, respectful of the normal process, while alert for complications, supporting the woman's own strength rather than taking over, honoring birth as a profound life event rather than merely a medical procedure. And it works. The evidence is now overwhelming. Multiple systematic reviews and meta-analyses have examined midwife-led care compared to physician-led care for low-risk women. The findings are consistent. Midwife-led care results in fewer interventions, epidurals, episiotomies, instrumental deliveries, cesarean sections, shorter hospital stays, higher rates of spontaneous vaginal birth, higher rates of successful breastfeeding, higher patient satisfaction, and equal or better outcomes for babies. Not worse outcomes, not just as safe if you're willing to sacrifice safety for experience. Actually better outcomes by most measures. This doesn't mean that obstetricians aren't valuable. They absolutely are, especially for high-risk pregnancies and complicated births. But it does mean that for the majority of pregnancies, which are low risk, midwifery care is not only safe but beneficial. Yet midwives still face challenges. In America especially, they struggle for full practice authority, for insurance reimbursement, for hospital privileges, for respect from the medical establishment. Turf battles continue, with some physician groups fighting against expanding midwifery scope of practice. Despite the evidence supporting midwifery care, access remains a problem too. There aren't enough midwives to meet demand, and they're unevenly distributed. Urban areas might have many choices. Rural areas might have none. Cost is a barrier for some families, especially for home birth, which insurance may not cover adequately. But midwifery continues to grow. More people are learning about it, considering it, choosing it. More students are entering midwifery programs. More research is being conducted, adding to the evidence base. More hospitals are developing midwifery services, recognizing that offering this choice attracts patients and improves outcomes. And the philosophy of midwifery is influencing obstetrics too. More obstetricians are adopting elements of the midwifery model: longer visits, continuous labor support, patience with the normal process, judicious use of intervention. This cross-pollination benefits everyone. Indigenous midwifery continues its renaissance, with programs sprouting in Native American, First Nations, Native Hawaiian, Maori, and other indigenous communities worldwide. These programs honor traditional knowledge while incorporating contemporary skills, creating culturally safe spaces for indigenous women to give birth, attended by their own people. It's healing work, undoing generations of colonial disruption of traditional birth practices around the world. Midwifery is being recognized as essential. The Lancet published a major series on midwifery in 2014, calling for investment in and expansion of midwifery globally. The United Nations includes strengthening midwifery in its Sustainable Development Goals. There's growing recognition that if we want to reduce maternal and infant mortality, especially in developing countries, training and supporting midwives is one of the most effective strategies. So, here we are, in the 21st century, and midwives are still catching babies, still supporting laboring women with skilled hands and calm presence, still passing knowledge from experienced practitioners to students, still advocating for women's choices and rights in birth, still honoring the ancient wisdom that birth is powerful and women are capable, the knowledge that began in a cave or a desert settlement tens of thousands of years ago, the knowledge that survived the rise and fall of civilizations, that survived witch hunts and medicalization and attempts at elimination. That knowledge continues. It has been transformed by time, certainly. Modern midwives use Dopplers and blood pressure cuffs, understand anatomy and physiology in ways their ancestors didn't, practice in contexts their ancestors couldn't have imagined, but the essence remains. The relationship between the woman giving birth and the woman attending her. The trust and the intimacy, the patience and the skill, the respect for the process and the readiness to act if needed. The belief that birth matters, that how we're born shapes us, that women deserve to be supported through one of life's most profound transitions. This is midwifery today, ancient and modern, science and art, knowledge and intuition, strength and tenderness, all woven together in service to mothers and babies, closing the eternal threatened, so we return. Dear dreamer, to where we began, to that room lit by a single flame, to those hands reaching out to guide new life into the world, to the moment of birth that has repeated itself billions upon billions of times since humans first walked the earth. Can you see her? The midwife, kneeling beside a laboring woman. She might be in a cave 40,000 years ago, firelight dancing on rock walls. She might be in a Mesopotamian mud brick house, invoking the goddess Nintu. She might be in a medieval village, crossing herself and murmuring prayers. She might be in a Victorian bedroom, defying the accusations of witchcraft, maintaining her craft in the face of suspicion. She might be in a mountain cabin in Kentucky, having ridden horseback through the night to arrive in time. She might be in a modern birth center, with soft lighting and a birthing tub, or in someone's home, with the birthing person's own sheets and the family dog snoozing in the corner. The details change, but the essence remains. Those hands, steady and skilled, that voice, calm and encouraging, that presence, confident and reassuring, that knowledge, passed down through generations, refined by experience, tested by countless births, proven by time. The history of midwives is not a story of continuous triumph. It's not a tale of unbroken respect and recognition. We've walked together through times when midwives were honored as servants of goddesses, and through times when they were burned as witches. We've seen them pushed aside by male physicians claiming authority, seen their knowledge dismissed as superstition, seen them fighting for the right to practice their craft. We've witnessed their near extinction in some times and places, and their stubborn persistence in others. It's been a complicated story, hasn't it? Full of joy and tragedy, progress and setbacks, honor and oppression. But through it all, one thread has remained unbroken: the need for someone who knows how to help when a baby is being born, and the existence of women who carry that knowledge. This is what makes the story of midwives so profound, so moving, so worth telling and retelling. They represent something fundamental about human resilience and women's strength. They show us that essential knowledge survives even when institutions try to suppress it, that women's expertise persists even when it's devalued, that the work of caring for mothers and babies continues across every barrier history can erect. Every single person who has ever lived was born. Let that sink in for a moment. Every human being who has walked this earth, from the first Homo sapiens in Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago to the baby born seconds ago somewhere in the world, every one of us entered life through the same doorway, the same profound physiological process. And more often than not, there was someone there who knew how to help, who had done this before, who could guide the newborn into life and care for the mother through her transformation. That's what birth is, you know. Not just the emergence of a new person, though it is that. It's also a transformation of the mother, a liminal experience that changes her forever. The Romans understood this. They had a goddess, Juno Lucina, who presided over the moment of birth, the moment when the child first sees light. Lucina, from lux, light, the bringing forth into light. And the woman who gives birth is also brought into new light, becoming a mother, crossing a threshold she can never uncross. Midwives have always understood this. That's why their care encompasses more than just the physical mechanics of birth. They attend to the emotional, the spiritual, the psychological dimensions. They honor the magnitude of the experience while remaining grounded in practical skill. They hold space for both the ordinary and the extraordinary nature of birth. And they do this work knowing, as they've always known, that sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes, despite all skill and care, mothers die, or babies die, or both die. This is the shadow side of birth. The reason why in pre-modern times pregnancy and birth were genuinely dangerous. Why women approached childbirth with a mixture of hope and fear. Midwives have always carried this knowledge too, the weight of losses, the grief of deaths they couldn't prevent, but they kept going. They kept attending births, kept catching babies, kept saving lives when they could, and bearing witness when they couldn't. This is perhaps their greatest testament to their dedication, that they continued despite the heartbreak, despite the losses, despite the fact that their work brought them face to face with life's most profound vulnerability in our modern world, where safe birth is more assured than ever before in human history, where maternal and infant mortality have dropped to levels our ancestors couldn't have imagined. It's easy to forget how precious this is, easy to take for granted that pregnancy and birth will result in a healthy mother and baby. Easy to lose sight of the fact that this safety, this remarkable improvement in outcomes, is built on centuries of accumulated knowledge, much of it carried by midwives. The understanding of how to manage postpartum hemorrhage, the knowledge of when labor is progressing normally and when it's not, the techniques for delivering a baby in difficult presentations, the recognition of preeclampsia and how to manage it, on and on. Each piece of knowledge was learned through observation and experience, often by midwives, often at great cost. We owe them such a debt. We owe the midwives of history, whose names we'll never know, whose faces are lost to time, who left no written records, but who caught babies and saved lives generation after generation. We owe the midwives who were accused of witchcraft but kept practicing anyway. We owe the midwives who were pushed aside by the medical establishment but fought back, organizing and advocating and refusing to disappear. We owe the midwives who preserved traditional knowledge in indigenous communities despite colonialism's attempts to erase it. We owe the midwives practicing today, carrying forward this ancient lineage into the present moment. And if you're listening to this and you were born, which I assume you were, then you owe a debt to someone caught you, cleaned you, helped you take your first breath. Maybe it was a midwife, maybe a doctor, maybe a nurse, maybe your grandmother in a place where hospital birth wasn't an option. But someone was there. Someone helped you into life. That's your first relationship, that connection to the birth attendant, even if you have no memory of it. As you drift toward sleep now, let yourself feel connected to this vast history. You are part of the unbroken chain of human birth, stretching back to the very beginning. Your own birth, your mother's birth, your grandmother's birth, on and on, back through time until we reach ancestors we can't name. Being born in circumstances we can barely imagine, attended by women whose hands we would recognize if we could see them. Those hands that pressed gently on bellies, that caught babies, that tied cords and cleared airways, that massaged and supported and encouraged. Those hands that mixed herbs and applied compresses, that examined and assessed, that knew through touch what was happening inside the laboring body. those hands that worked by firelight and candlelight, by oil lamp and gaslight and electric light, those hands that were rough with labor or smooth with privilege, that were young or old, that were black or brown or white or every shade between. Those hands were skilled. Those hands were knowledgeable. Those hands were capable. And those hands, amazingly, miraculously, still exist in the present moment. Somewhere right now, in this very moment, as you listen to these words, a midwife is attending a birth. Her hands are guiding a baby into the world, continuing the work that has never ceased, that has gone on every single day throughout all of human history. The eternal thread holds, the knowledge continues, the work goes on, and perhaps this is the greatest gift that the story of Midwives offers us, the reminder that some things persist, that care and skill passed from one generation to the next can survive anything, that women's knowledge, women's expertise, women's work has always been valuable, even when institutions claimed otherwise, that the most fundamental human experiences, like giving birth and being born, create connections across time that nothing can sever. So rest now, dear one. Let your breathing slow to the rhythm of the ancient tide, the in and out of breath that echoes labor, the pulse that connects all living things. Let yourself float on the knowledge that you are part of this story, that every human is part of this story, that we are all bound together by the simple fact of having been born. Dream of hands reaching through darkness toward light. Dream of women's voices saying, "You're almost there, just a little more. I've got you." Dream of babies crying their first cries, announcing their arrival into air and sound and touch. Dream of the moment when every human life began, that threshold crossing from inside to outside, from water to air, from one form of existence to another. Dream of the midwives, all of them, across all of time. Thank them in your dreams. Honor them in your rest. Let their legacy live in your consciousness, even as you slip into unconsciousness. They caught you. They caught all of us. They brought us into the light, and somewhere, right now, they're still doing it, still attending the eternal mystery and mundane miracle of birth, still holding the thread that connects past to present to future. Sleep now, beloved dreamer, held by that knowledge. Rest in the care of the invisible hands that stretch across time. You are safe. You are held. You belong to this long, beautiful story of human birth and the women who attend it. The midwives continue. The knowledge endures. The work is holy and ordinary, extraordinary and simple, ancient and ever-new. May you wake tomorrow carrying something of this history in your heart. May you remember the midwives when you need reminding that persistence matters, that women's work matters, that caring for each other is how we survive. Sleep well, dear one. Sleep in peace. The eternal thread holds, and you are woven into it, as all of us are, forever.